Well, good morning, everyone. So I do apologize for the delay. We're having some technical difficulties with our guest speaker for uploading the presentation. So I do apologize that we're 6 minutes late, but well, I think we'll get started. So he's still getting his presentation all up and running, but I do see a lot of new faces here. So I wanted to introduce myself, introduce our program, and introduce the things that we're doing at Texas A&M. So my name is Garrett Slater. I'm assistant professor and apiculture specialist at Texas A&M. So my primary specialty and I guess my position is related to honeybees and beekeeping, but I am sort of the de facto native pollinator specialist. So I get a lot of questions and do a lot of programs for master gardeners on bees and pollinators. So I'd love to, start building this program and promoting more about the work that we can do to support native pollinators. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about our program a little bit. So this is a brand new program at Texas A&M. So I'm located in Overton, Texas. So if you look at that map of Texas, I'm in far east Texas, near Tyler, Texas. I'm based out of a research and extension center out there, but I do have a statewide appointment. So even though I'm located in East Texas, I travel across the entire state and provide support to beekeepers primarily. So what we typically do is we do a lot of beekeeping 101 courses, beekeeping 201 courses. I do queen rearing and insemination courses. So I do, a lot of those advanced courses kind of all together. I do a lot of traveling to master gardener groups across East Texas and North Texas to speak about native pollinators and talk about this kind of how cool the diversity of bees are across the entire state of Texas. So, but yeah, really along with our team is we have three specialists in different regions of Texas. So we have Dr. Omar Martinez, who is located in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. So he has a facility up there, and he's also offering a beekeeping 101 course on May 2nd. So if you're interested in Dallas, Fort Worth, I'd reach out to them. If you're a master gardener group, for example, or um, if you're a master gardener group or you want somebody to come in to speak about native pollinators, please reach out to him. He's actually located in Tarrant County. So if you're a Tarrant County master gardener, that's where Omar's facility is. In San Antonio, we have Molly Keck. So she is a specialist that her primary focus is just kind of general entomology. So she does a lot of kind of general entomology, kind of education support. I know she has a youth education program for teaching about entomology. But she also has 25% appointment with honeybees and apiculture. And then we have a person in Houston that we're currently working on hiring. So whenever we get that person hired, we'll have somebody in Houston. So we have a full team of, about 4 people. So we're really excited to kind of build a program from there. So what we do is talk about our master beekeeping program just a little bit. So really the one thing to keep in mind, and if you're a master gardener, you do understand just how kind of extension works at Texas A&M. If you're new to extension or if you're a beekeeper that's not familiar with extension, I do want to explain kind of how extension works overall. So Texas has 254 counties, and we have a county agent in each county. And so what's really great about Texas versus other states is we have this really massive grassroots effort where we work directly with a person in that county. So really for me, that's been really useful for me to kind of share information. If you're a master gardener, you guys really understand just how important kind of having that county agent and that county support is. And if you're not familiar, I would recommend getting to know your county agent, letting them know that you want more bee and pollinator programs, and potentially for this GNBee program, things you can do in the future to really promote that. But yeah, as you can also see, we have these research and extension centers across the state. I think a lot of people are confused at why I'm located in Overton versus, Call Station, for example. And really the main reason is, they really want extension to be kind of where the beekeepers are and where the stakeholders are, right? And so they put me in East Texas and Overton for really that very reason. So, but there are several 10 located across state Texas. So I would get to know those type of people because they're doing a lot of really great research and extension efforts in different parts of the state. Okay. I'm gonna talk about our goals a little bit when related to not only honeybees but also native pollinators, right? Because there's a lot of recent losses for bees and pollinators. So for honeybees, for example, we've been seeing these massive annual loss rates really ever since 2005. And I grew up as a beekeeper. My uncle, he was a commercial beekeeper. He managed around 20,000 colonies, so he had an important role for this type of commercial pollination. So um, I've been seeing these losses really ever since I started beekeeping in the mid 90s. And I get these questions all the time about why are the bees dying and why are honeybee losses, extremely high this past year versus years past, right? These last year is about 62%. And there's really these kind of five P's related to bee losses, right? We have number one, parasites. Parasites are these viral mites that feed on the bees and they transmit deadly viruses, and they're the really major driver of bee losses. And it appears that the problem for Varroa is getting worse and worse and worse. And from a beekeeper's perspective, the major issue for parasites is, you're trying to develop an insecticide for a Varroa pest, which can be really difficult. Now, for native pollinators, Varroa mites aren't an issue, but for honeybees, they are. For the viruses, right, and pathogens, the viruses can be transmitted by the Varroa mites, but viruses could also be transmitted to native pollinators in different routes, right? So even though viruses are, a really major driver of bee and honeybee losses, they can drive some of the native bee losses. We think about pesticides. So, really the goal of this presentation is talk about kind of ground nesting bees and how you as a person can go out and do some citizen science to identify these ground nesting bees, right? So when you apply pesticides, for example, and it gets into the nesting homes of these ground nesting bees, that can lead to, death for these native pollinators that are really hard to detect, right? So pesticides do have a big impact on, honeybees, but they can have equally, if not greater, impact on some of our native pollinators. We think about poor nutrition. So we think about kind of stratification of land, urbanization, for example, where the land that was typically set aside for conservation or native pollinator homes, or even foraging for honeybees, we see that's being put into kind of urban development or into real crops, for example, that provide no nutritional benefit to bees or other pollinators. So it's really important to think about what we can do to really support our pollinators, whether that's planting a pollinator garden and focusing our planting on very specific crops or flowers that support pollinators, or if you have higher acreage land, what can you plant to support those bees? So I know one program we're launching very soon is a bee lawn program. So you'll be able to buy just a box. The box will come in with a whole guide on which plants support bees and native pollinators. We'll have a seed mixture that you can plant right in your lawn, and it comes with clover, such as a crimson clover and um, the small Dutch white clover. What's great about it, you can mow it and it comes back every 2 weeks, right? And it's also short growing, so it doesn't grow very tall. So I think it's a perfect thing for anybody that's located in the city. And so we'll be having more information about that very, very soon. And then finally, Port Queen. So the reason I kind of point to these five P's are, some of these are really, I mean, all of these are the major driver for honeybee losses. Some of them are also contributing to some of our native bee pollinator losses. We just have more information on honeybees rather than native pollinators. So, okay, that's kind of a little bit about that. We'll see if Jordan is all ready.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. So want me to introduce you? Do you have your presentation to
So
get this
this
set
is
up?
going to be kind of exciting. So
Okay,
essentially, because of this StreamYard, it won't let me share my screen without totally resetting everything and putting in weird permissions. So let's make a more exciting approach here. And let's maybe open this up as a presentation that's more of a discussion. And then you and I, this might be one cool idea is to kind of walk through what like live what the project is,
I love
and you
it.
can share your screen. And again, this is completely unscripted and not part of the original plan, but let's see what happens.
And
On top,
I do some pictures of like sweat bees and cellophane bees. So if you want those to pull up, I can do that. So I've
yeah,
already
and then simultaneously I am emailing you the presentation, which happens to be an entire gig, so it's taking
perfect.
a little long to get your way. And then I also forwarded you an email of a Dropbox link where I made a recording of this of a presentation that was similar to what I was hoping to give today. So
Love
you
it.
could try to open that and see how it goes. So I might put a little bit more work on you than I would have liked, but I'm sorry that this new system is has some technical issues on my end.
No worries at all. So how we do that, and then you kind of introduce yourself and a project, and then we can maybe have a just kind of a general discussion.
Yeah. Okay. So this project is called Project GNBee. Um, it really started after a long effort of mine to study the microbiome of brood cells of solitary bees. So when we're talking about most bees, we're talking about solitary ground nesting bees. So there's 20,000 species of bees worldwide. 65 to 75% of them nest in the ground, and 90% of them are solitary. So when you add up the solitary bees in the ground plus their solitary bee parasites of those bees, it comes out to 90. And so really when people are thinking about native bees, what they should have in their mind's eye is a ground nesting solitary bee. And it's important for people that aren't, well experienced with ground nesting bees, and especially solitary ones, is that they're very gentle. So you have the opportunity to study them up real close. Now, if you see a nest entrance of bees and there's lots of bees going in and out, then it's a social bee. And then they have resources that they like to defend. So this is not what we're working on, and you don't want to get really close to those. So keep that difference in mind. So as I was working to understand the bacteria and fungi that were being collected by the adult bees and passed on into these little nutrient packets for the next generation, remember they have no overlapping generations or parental care. So all the information, all the resources are passed on in this brood cell and in this mass provision pollen ball, right? So this is what I was interested in studying at the time. And in order to get a sense of, what was going on for the species, you had to be able to get multiple pollen balls at the same time. And they had to be ones that weren't already being consumed by larvae or had otherwise aged. So you really had to know where bees were nesting. And that was an incredibly large challenge. There was no resource, there was no ability to figure out what bees were where we could find them to study them. And this became the impetus to start this project, which was really like, let's bring together people from all over the world, really. But, a lot of our research is done here in the US, and have them report on the bees that they're seeing nesting, in particular, especially these large groups of bees that will nest in the tens, hundreds, thousands, up into the millions. And so we don't really know the upper bounds. The biggest aggregations have yet to be studied. And so we're just trying to put those places on the map, and we're starting to work with the people that discover them to improve what they're observing so we get a better sense of what's there, and then engage them and include them. So this would be you guys, this audience, into learning about what bees are there and then contributing sources of data. So observational notes, site notes, but also physical samples such as soil or individuals from the site, and so that we can better understand the biology of this site. And this is a live recording, but let's keep it open. If anybody has questions and so forth, since there's not a PowerPoint presentation, feel free to let me know what you're thinking and what's going on. And so this project now has sort of three main branches here. This is like this outreach and communications that fuels the research side of this. And then there's the ever important conservation side. So it's, we want to, once we know where these guys are in the landscape, keep them around, right? That's step number one. They're unique sites. So like bees do not just nest just haphazardly across the landscape. They're like super heterogeneous in their population structure. And so it may be one person's backyard, in the whole area for that species. Or it may be, a cemetery. We're finding those to be great refugia for bees. But it could be any particular like unique spot that just happens to have the right attributes and the right management that will allow bees to successfully nest year after year. And so we don't know the upper limits of those nesting, right, in those locations, but it can be well over 80 years old. We don't know, and people haven't been keeping records. But these are the type of information that eventually we'll get to know. Like, do these populations for a given species, they typically last a year, 10 years, 100 years. Like, we don't know. So so it's important that we think about these bees, about their nesting habitat as like the crucial limiting resource to understanding parts of their biology that we totally don't understand, which I'll go into in a little bit.
Yep.
But also that we keep those places around in the environment, and that's the conservation side. So knowing about them, step one, and then learning about them, to you need to know what it is to love it, and then you need to make people aware in the community what it is and how important it is, because most people are scared off. Like, they do not understand that it's an important aspect of the local pollination services. It provides all the pollination for all the diversity of plants that we see in our environment and that we want to keep around. So getting people to observe that biology is really important and aids in that conservation. So with this project, what's really cool is once we know where those sites are, and we're going to talk about how to record them, is that you can visit them. And most years they're going to be active above ground the same time of year, because they're timed with the flowering events. So the plants know, usually when it's okay to flower, and the bees know when it's okay to come out of the ground and pollinate those flowers and begin preparations for the next generation. So all of that's just really important. And we're interested in that timing as well. And then
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Can we take a step back? Just,
Yeah.
we might have a lot of people that they may see some bees in a flower, right? And
Yeah.
they may have, so let's start with just like the very basics, right? So I kind of show this graphic of like the social spectrum, and that's one thing
Right.
I've just loved about bees and like Hymenoptera in general. They come in these like different lifestyle styles, right? Different social spectrums. So do you want to talk about this just a little bit more? So even ground nesting bees, for example, some could be solitary, some could be communal, right? So you want to talk about that a little bit more, just so people
We
that
can,
have no
yeah, we
idea.
can, yeah, a little bit about the sociality of bees. I mean, it is a sliding spectrum. There, I mean, it is very fascinating, all the different ways that they've learned to exist. But the history of bees, the evolutionary history of bees, is solitary and ground nesting, right? They come from solitary hunting wasps, and then they change, certain lineages change their diets to pollen as a protein source instead of insects primarily as a protein source. And so that's how bees and wasps are interrelated. But the background, and why they're probably the most diverse in that solitary life history state, is that's their evolutionary history. And some of these more social bees, I mean, there's a lot of quirks and a lot of different things that go on, well, I guess we could say they're equally derived, but they've specialized in different strategies. But there are some, and it's not as common, but there are ground nesting bees that are communal. So they will share the singular nest interest. One of the ones that comes up a lot is Agopastum invarescens, and this bee is bright, shiny green, and so people notice it a lot. But they will, you're talking about like 10 individuals using a nest entrance and sharing some of the burden for rearing their offspring. And then there's other groups of bees that change their sociality slightly depending upon their elevation. So it's a very nuanced game that's being played. But most important for this project is when you see insects hovering around the ground and you start to see some of them going into the ground with pollen, or if you are able to recognize a bee that's not your traditional bee at the outset, is that you're looking for these multiple nest entrances. And so you're looking for what is an aggregation. So I can show a little bit of this if you wanted to pull up. Again, I don't know if the talk came through via the drive or via the email that I've sent. It's still uploading. But if you pull up gnbee.org, we can run through just a few little things here.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to download it, but it keeps kicking me out. That's why the presentation comes on and on.
Yeah. So, but if you just go to the website, gnbee.org, this is what I have created as an overview for the project, and it holds some of the keys here, just to the background knowledge, but also more importantly, how to access some of the resources in order to become involved.
Okay, I'm gonna pull this up. So gnbee.org. Yeah, so you guys have a chance to jump on
gnbee.org. Yeah, ground nesting bee. That's what we're that's what we're after. But the point is that you're looking for, areas where multiple bees are nesting in the same locality. Now we do want your observations that you can take, so photo observations of singular bees, because they might be more rare bees or bees that we don't know much about. But importantly is we're trying to track down where are these large groups of bees. So we're going to continue talking about some of these bees in general. And, so as I was mentioning, the third pillar of this approach is really what can we do with that information? And what we can do with it is start to learn how. So there's this little image. So we talked a little bit about the background research of bees, which we'll go into. We talked a bit about how knowing where those bee aggregations are leads to important conservation. But then there's this component that we can build off of, which is towards applied management. So once we know where the bees are, people can reliably depend on those bees for their pollination services. But we're also interested in how we can shape habitat to support bees. So what are the different management events, activities that people are doing that bees are taking advantage of? Like, for example, our largest aggregations that we know of so far are in the cemeteries on the East Coast in particular. So we don't know yet where they'll be in other states, in other parts of the country. But it's likely because those are well-drained soils and consistently easy to dig because of the sand, but they're also mowed consistently so they don't get overgrown, on the order of years to decades. And so the bees can take advantage of that space for these long periods of time. And that can be really, really helpful. If you scroll down a little bit, I can give. There's a question here from Carol. I have 15 years of native bee photos from a tract of land. Will you be taking observations from the past or just the future? So if those observations are of the bees nesting in the ground, yes, we want them. So that will help create that timeline. And you can put those observation notes so we know. So as we're looking forward and we say, well, we know that these bees can nest in this area longer than, 15 years, right? That kind of information is important. And it's really, I think, imperative to impress upon people that how little we actually know about the nesting biology for most species of bees, like especially these native ground nesting bees. Most things are not known, right? So like, and where we do have information, it typically comes from one study, from one location, and it's like a description of hopefully a little bit about the nest architecture, but often it's about the larval stage of the bee, and a little bit about the context of the bee, but that's about it. So like we need a lot more information about what they're nesting in, how well they're doing there, how long they persist there. You name it about the nesting biology of the bees, we don't know it. So that's really important.
Yeah, no, I always like to show this graphic to show you like how much we know about native pollinators, right? So like the darker blue colors are where there's been more sampling, but one thing you see is there's just a lot of white. Even in Texas, right? Even if you look in Texas, like there's some hot spots, but overall, like the whole state is white. So we know very very little. And I always kind of like to use honeybees as an indicator species. So if they're struggling, probably the native pollinators are struggling the same, if not more, right? And so if we're
Right.
seeing these massive bee losses with honeybees, like how's that impacting native pollinators, right? But we really have no idea. So, and I think like every year, there's identification of like 3 or 4 new bee species, right? So we're still learning more.
Right.
Like sweat bees, for example, we're always identifying new sweat bee species like in Texas. So
Especially records within the state, right? Like, yeah,
exactly.
the whole community that's there is unknown. But what's also kind of cool about this project is that we're not trying to reach to the very far edges to find the next, rare bee that's in the state, right? We're actually like,
Mhm.
where are the common bees nesting? Like,
Yep.
we don't know that. Where is like the bulk of the important habitat for maintaining bees in the environment? Like, we don't know that. So it's really great because it gives people the opportunity, like your community scientists or anybody participating in this talk, going forward, to actually find something and use basic observation to create novel data that we will then use to better understand why bees nest and where they nest and why they nest there. And so that's just such a cool attribute of this project, is it's open to everyone. And because bees nest in every place, ground nesting bees, that it's available to anyone anywhere. They just need to have an open eye and so forth. So we'll get to a little bit in just a moment too about um, how to make those contributions. But if you go back to the gnbee.org, we can just talk through a little bit more here. I like to show this image of the nesting biology. That was a really nice artist rendition. Um, and this one here. So, I mean, this is really what a single mother hard at work does in the course of her lifetime. And each individual bee will create about between like 5 and 25 different brood cell chambers. So they have a central entrance like of their tumuli, but then they have these laterals, and from those laterals, they'll make these little chambers, and they'll seal them off in very different ways. So they're using glandular secretions to help line the walls to keep the tunnels from collapsing and to keep out moisture, keep out fungi, keep out maybe predators. And then they'll even make more robust linings for where they're putting their pollen materials. And some of these materials form these perfect little spherical balls. Some of them are more liquid. Like each bee is doing something totally different. And it's fascinating to think about how they can preserve these resources underground without them spoiling. And it looks like that people are starting, that they're using a lot of acidification of those pollen provisions, like we do with yogurt and other foods that we would have to store on the shelf to keep them from spoiling. Okay, so how would a layperson or a master gardener look for bees? So that's what we're going to. So we can, if we scroll down, maybe people can follow along on the gnbee.org. There's a link here that says find us on iNaturalist, ground nesting bees, right there. If you click on that link, it'll take you to the community project. And so I hope you're following along. I think my screen here is just me, but if we can get back to a shared screen. This gives you an overview of all the observations that are made on the project. So you have 8,500 observations worldwide, contributed by 3,500 individuals. And we do strongly encourage people to join, because it really helps us know who's engaging and where that engagement is coming from. But what I like to do is if you click on the observations, and then you go, like click on observations, just that on the left under the totals. Yep. And then you go to the map, which is on the top left. It gives you a different view of the map, but it's kind of a trick of the trade. This map is much more nicer. And then you can zoom into Texas and zoom into where you are. And so these are, again, so we're sort of limited in our observations of Texas so far, but there are some. And if you're near one of these places that has an observation, my recommendation for people is to go to one around the time that it's been observed. Maybe check and make sure it's not, in somebody's backyard first, but often they're not. And then go observe one of these observations. That one right there, let's click on it and see if we can just learn something, just because it happens to be the one that you clicked on. And so if you sort of take a look at this, so this observation has only been identified to the genus level so far. You can see that the bee is nesting in the ground, so we know that's a good observation for the project. Somebody put a little marker down to sort of give us some scale. That can be helpful. But here's what you don't see. You don't see the scale of the aggregation. So like you don't have the context here. So what we really like to do is get people to go back to these sites and make repeat observations, which is just equally as helpful. But give us some of the wider angle shots. Let us, maybe even take a shot of the canopy over, if there is any. Take a shot of, just give us a sense of how many bees are nesting there, and make notes about what's going on. Like, for example, is this a south facing slope? Is this, a really steep slope, or is it flat? Which way is it? Like, what is the aspect? Which way is it? The direction? Is it, north facing, south facing? Is it slope? Is it just appear to be a uniquely sandy spot? Is it someone's, sandbox, or is it just the parent soil from that area? Like, all this kind of context really matters, and allows us to know whether or not this is a site that we would want to follow up on Like, for example, if it's just one bee, and this isn't a rare bee, then maybe we just let it be, we let it alone, right? But if it's like a field of bees, which it can be, that might be an opportunity for us to sample or study it in greater detail without any risk to the population of that location, if that makes sense. How does that sound good?
That's good. Yeah, and we had a question about like what is the distance between nests, which probably with anything it probably varies.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So sometimes they're kind of looking like they're coming up right underneath. And here's the thing about some of these places where we have large numbers of bees is you actually will have many different species nesting in the same place too. So they're doing different things and they're nesting in different densities. And they're nesting in different depths. And so like there's all of this is co-occurring, right? And then each bee has its typically a bee parasite that's going after it, right? So you've got these other insects that sort of look more like wasps, but they're actually bees of attacking, basically laying their eggs on top of the work of the host bee. And so there's a lot of biology to record at these sites. So this is where I would point people to, that have the ability to get, close to one of these locations that's already been recorded. But other than that, you know, if you're just out and about and you're looking around and you've got this mind's eye, when the bees are really active, you'll come to these opportunities where you'll see a lot of insects just hovering over the ground. And if you're curious, you'll go, "Well, what's going on here?" And that's when you figure out, oh, there's a lot of nest entrances here. Bees are bringing in pollen. Or if it's the early time, earlier in the season, you might just have males just swarming over the ground, right? And so that might catch your attention. You'll be like, oh, maybe I'll come back in a week or two and see what this is all about, right? So there's all these different signs to look for, and it gives you the opportunity to make one of these initial observations. So I think there
We
was a question about a garden.
Yeah. Yeah, so we had some questions about I guess like what can you do as like an everyday person, right? So I mean, obviously this is a really great tool that people can use to like help identify,
Yeah.
these bee species, right? Next thing is like what can like just a master gardener or somebody just in the city do to support the bees? And so
Yeah.
one person asked like, for example, or like planting, like
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are programs for planting. I mean, this has been the push for such a long time. This is what we've heard about the most. And so I'm taking this in a different direction. And it is really important that bees have food to eat and so forth. But if we don't know where they nest, it won't matter how many flowers there are, right? Like they need available nesting, and it's not clear at this point what they need to nest, right? So how to support bees in general, there are these diverse approaches, and people can get involved in creating resources, like very much so in the line of something Xerxes would recommend, right? Like having different areas that you don't mow at certain times of the year, right? Like leave flowers available in certain parts of the yard, like keep sticks. And these are all great strategies for helping insect biology in general. But this project is really about making records of where these bees occur. And then when you have made a great record, and like if it's a sizable population, then we will reach out to you, and we'll have this back and forth about, okay, here's what else we'd like to know about it. And then we can send little kits for sampling. In a number of cases, for certain species that we're on about at the moment, we're putting out traps to try to figure out the phenology of the bees and what's how the timing of the bees. So when do the males emerge? When do the females emerge? When do the parasites emerge? What are all the diversity of parasites related to the bees? And so there's this massive amount of basic biology and ecology that we have to understand first before we can realistically do anything about enhancing the bees in the environment, right? So
yeah, and
what you're yeah,
I've always heard, for the ground nesting bees, I don't know how accurate these estimates are, but about 75% of, the native pollinators in the US are ground nesting, right? And I don't know,
right.
I'm not sure how accurate those numbers are. And what I've seen is people recommend like mulching, for example, could serve as like basically concrete for bees because it impacts like their ability to ground nest. Now, we may not know the information, right? And maybe yeah, maybe
No,
it doesn't matter at all, right?
it really just, I
Or
mean,
like piles of sticks. Like I think, like you said, Xerxes like recommend like, hey, at the end of the year, leaves, sticks, put them in a pile, and
and
maybe
this
it's
is
just kind of assumption. Yeah.
yeah, well, this, I mean, it's pretty good knowledge and wisdom for helping insect diversity in general, giving insects a place to hide, giving them a place to hibernate, right? Like, you need all of that, right? If you, especially if you want to keep birds around and other, amphibians around and everything, right? That relies on the insects also. You really need all this diverse habitat. You don't want everything to be perfectly manicured or homogeneous.
Yep.
But in terms of figuring out for ground nesting bees specifically, this is probably the best thing we can do is figure out where they are, why they're nesting there, where else could they nest if we managed it properly. So there's a question here about planting for pollinators, and certainly those food resources helps. Having margins, having especially if adjacent to farms, often that means that it's not ideal farm land, and that's where bees will come from, right? And that's where they'll go
Yep.
get resources. But in some cases, they may be nesting in the rows between crops, right? And we want to know that. So we want to know what are the bees that will nest in between the crop rows and still make it, that will handle certain depths of tillage, right? Because like we're thinking, okay, well, we can make these blanket recommendations of how to till, when not to till, how deep to till. I mean, but it really does depend on the species, because some species of bees will nest 6 feet deep. So you're not really going to mess them up in that regard. And whereas other bees may only nest a few centimeters deep. And then when it comes to sprays and all these type of things, I mean, this is really important stuff, right? I mean, it really matters, especially insecticides. We don't really know, as fungicides and they may affect certain bees more than others. That's what it looks like. But like the timing of the sprays matters, right? So like if you can do it well before their peak flight activity or well after, right? Like, so all those things are important bits of information, but they're a little outside of the scope of what we're trying to do here.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, and the reason I pulled this up too, or if you do want to make a difference, like just know that pesticides, and we're still learning more, right? That's really the goal of this is science project.
Yeah.
But really try to reduce the type of pesticides you're using in the yard if possible, right? Some can be more toxic to bees. We're still learning more about that, but just understand that there's different types of insecticides, and some are more toxic to bees, and some are less toxic to bees, right? Like in
Yeah.
general, insecticides are designed for an insect pest. So really, I mean, my major recommendation is really to like learn how to read the label. Right, the label is really the law. So understand the label, and usually it'll give some information, at least for honeybees. So just because it says something about honeybees doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna be toxic for like pollinators, or maybe might be more pot toxic for pollinators. But this is one thing you can look at, is to kind of look at the label and kind of read that a bit more. The one thing I typically point to is like understand the residual toxicity. At least for honeybees, that tells you how long that chemical is toxic for bees, right? So is it toxic for 4 hours, or is it toxic for multiple days? So that's one thing I would understand, and try to limit the use if possible. And if you have to use some kind of chemical intervention, then try to use something that's less toxic for bees.
Yeah.
And I do have this information for the residual toxicity for both honeybees and I think bumblebees. So we have all the information I think for most bumblebees, but yeah, if you have any more information, just reach out to me.
And then I was wondering if you could go back to the gnb.org. I did
Yep.
want to point people to one of the tabs, or a couple of the other tabs that are very helpful. The first one that's really important is how to make an observation. Actually, why don't we, when you bring it up here, why don't you show us just one of the little brief videos so at the menu, and you can show people what we're actually looking at. But there's this on the nesting site videos. I've got millions of these, but I'd have to upload them. I still need to work on that. If you scroll down, I guess, if you're at the top, keep scrolling. These are just cool videos that I thought, but at the bottom here or somewhere on this page, yeah, right here. If you could open up one of these, and if it will play enough, or let people kind of go to one of these, like, and it's maybe easiest on the shed, but this is what we're talking. We're talking about millions of bees. So that cemetery site, we estimated the emergence at 5.5 million bees for one species that's nesting there. And so that is an insane number of bees that come out consistently every spring, and they're timed with the apple pollination in the spring. And so that's a very important site for the region, and in order to understand and to keep around the pollination sources, resources that we need. And that's about the equivalent of 250 honeybee colonies. So just in that site, 250 honeybee colonies that become active, that need zero management all year long, right? Pretty much zero. And provide all the pollination for apples and so many other early spring plants, um, just reliably. Like, that's such a great resource. And that the weight of those bees is at, like 4 American bison or one woolly mammoth, right? So it's like you have a super megafauna worth of biology right under your feet, and we don't even keep track of those. So that's something I wanted to put forth, and I love these little slow motion videos because they, again, anything that helps you understand what you're looking at. Since we are sending the information on to us and we're trying to figure out, okay, let's place this in context. How important is this site? These wide angle shots, these different, you know, uh, scales of the observation. So these little videos can be pretty fun also. And then if back to the gnb.org, if there's a tab there that says on the menu, if you click there, it says how to, yeah, reporting an observation. So a lot of our audience here and people that are new to iNaturalist, this is a step-by-step for how you make an observation. And I've done it in two ways, one for your phone and one for the computer. Now, there's benefits to both. Like, I find it easier to upload things on the phone, but then it's harder to make some of the specific notes, like especially write in like what you're seeing. But also sometimes it's more tricky. um I don't know, there's just little tricks to both, so I recommend trying both. And I like to use both. If you're in the field, you need your phone to make the photo observations, but sometimes it's good to bring them back and try to upload on the computer if you're going to write out the notes. I find that to be more easy to handle. Okay, so we have a question here. I have a working fountain in my yard. I've noticed dozens of so congregating around the base of the fountain recently. I don't know. Around the base of the fountain, I guess I can't speak to that. Why that would be? I mean, there may be little bits of water. Maybe they're trying to actually collect water that isn't, not risking that they would fall into it. But I honestly, I don't know what's going on there. Maybe it could be something to do with the vibration. Even there's something they find interesting. So I really don't know
The
that
wonderful
particular.
world of bees, right?
Yeah.
If we knew
That's
everything, we wouldn't have jobs, right?
so
So
there's a lot to know. And our main questions, I mean, it's really important to understand, we're really interested in the life history, understand life history, the phenology. Um, we're interested in their nest construction. But when we know where these bees are, and you mentioned about pesticides, those are opportunities to understand the pesticide risk at their most sensitive location. So they're bringing back all that floral material into the ground in one spot, right? So we can start to get what is their pesticide exposure and risk on their bodies while they're above ground. But maybe, and more importantly, perhaps, is this exposure from the soil and the ground themselves? Because think about this bee. Like, we think about a bee flying around, right? Well, like 99% of its life is underground.
yeah.
Like, they're developing underground. Some bees take multiple years to develop underground. But even if it's an adult bee that is foraging and provisioning, it's still going to spend like 90% of its time underground preparing these chambers, getting everything ready, sleeping at night. It's only going out and doing these foraging trips usually as fast as it can, right? Because that's the costly part. And creating these, so that exposure risk in the soil is going to be really interesting and important, and it can only learn about that from studying these aggregations.
Yep.
And then we're very, very interested in like the soil texture, the soil composition, the compaction, the moisture. And so that's, once we find these cool spots, that's the next step, right? Like, that's where we get to like, oh, what is going on in the soil. But then there's also the biotic component. So what are the flowers that they're visiting? What are the other nest resources? What other species are there? So yeah, one thing that we're finding is that you get these large aggregations of one species, right? But then these more rare species or less common ones, they're nesting inside of those aggregations. So you wouldn't even notice it unless you use certain techniques to figure out, there was like one out of every 100 are actually something else. So that's pretty fascinating. And it takes all of us working together to figure this out. I mean, this is not something that one person can do or one group can do. That's what's so great about talking to you all, is to empower you to help contribute, because we'll never know why bees nest where they do
Mhm.
without your observations.
Yep, and I just want to address this comment with like mosquito abatement, right? Especially in kind of the southern part of Texas. So really, each year the city develops a plan for the mosquito abatement, right? And it's kind of based on a surveillance plan, but they always have some kind of chemical in place, and this chemical can change over time. I know at least for honeybees, some years it's more toxic, some years it's less toxic. One thing we're doing is like increasing communication with the cities and municipalities. Now, I know we're doing a demonstration study with San Antonio. We're working with them to develop an IPM plan for the mosquitoes that lessens their risk to bees and other pollinators. And so we're kind of starting with San Antonio. We can hopefully expand to other municipalities. The one issue of that is figuring out who does the spraying, right? So for like San Antonio, for example, they have their own pesticide applicator like on staff. So it's easier
Uh-huh.
for me to communicate with that person. Whereas if they hire like a private person, I would need that person's information to work with them. So
Right.
like part of the project, get more information, but if we get more information, we can start developing these type of demonstration studies, work with the cities, work with the
Yeah.
applicators, and can say, hey, these are things that you should probably be avoiding, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't want
Especially,
disease to be spread with mosquitoes, but this would be
right.
a really great project. Yeah,
Especially in close proximity to where these sites are. So like
exactly.
as you as a community are taking stock of what are these big aggregations in your environment, you're like, hey, let's like look at what's going around this area in
Yep,
particular. Might narrow down the scope of like how to make a more
exactly.
important impact. Is like, okay, we need to know who's doing what around this area, because we don't want to put this central hub, like this mega population that is providing, basically the population genetics and the resource for new founder populations, don't put that spot at risk. So
Yep,
that
and
I
and
think
and and, and we're really basically doing that with the honeybees, right? Because the honeybee colonies are, and it's easy for a beekeeper to register that. Why can't we do
right.
that with like these native nests, right? It's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
exact same information, like, hey, these are spots that you should try to avoid or use something different, right? So it's just
right.
more information that we can use to work with these
Yeah, and they're
applicators.
long term. I mean, the honeybees, they often get brought in, they're taken out, but in this case, these bees are they're there for the long haul as long as they can make it. And one thing I really should want to mention too is that when you make this observation, as long as it's not a very sensitive species, please make the basically the record of like how close to the point of the observation as narrow as possible, so that we don't have these big bounds around them. Because one thing that we're trying to do is pull basically other information that's available through like USGS, such as like the soil texture layers and the cropland data and the climatic layers and all these different data that's available through GIS, in order to create the profile for where the bees are nesting, what they're experiencing. And so it's really handy if you guys can, when you make those observations, just narrow it down as close as possible. So again, it's just to pull information related to that site. And so yes, that's all that's used for, but it's really, really important information.
I have a question here from Bruce. So, from a completely novice perspective, you mentioned quote male bees swarming around early in the season.
Yeah.
What's the season time frame?
Yeah, so every bee is different. That's what's so cool. So that's why we have so many different bees. And so think about it in the context of flowers, right? Like you've got different flowering events throughout the early spring, mid spring, early summer, late summer, on and on and on, right? Well, the bees are the same. Like they're co-evolved to interact with these different groups of flowers. And so their emergence times are equal, right? So they're coming out and they're taking advantage of these resources, and then they go below ground. You won't see them until the next year. They're not gone, they're just underground. And so that timing is specific to each bee in each region. So that's what we're trying to figure out also by looking at the same species across space. How variable is it, right? Like, so in the US, we get our first aggregation observations from Florida in February. So it's happening, right? And so they're, the bees are, I'm up here in Ithaca, New York, right? We expect them to start to emerge in a couple weeks. So our first big, bee releases from the ground. So it's happening now. I would imagine there in Texas already. Again, depending a little bit upon your microclimate. Um, but so keep that in mind. And so the above ground activity is on the order of weeks, from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, 8 weeks, right? It might be the most for a lot of these species. So keep that in mind. So when you're observing, there'll be this revolving door of different bees that are in your environment, and that you'll have different opportunities to make observations of for.
So I think what we'll do is we'll kind of do some quick questions, kind of go through these all. I don't think they'll take too long. First one, is there a place where we get a list of specific bee species we shouldn't be posting?
Yeah, not that I am aware of or would even worry about it. I mean, if you happen to take an observation of a rare bee, that's great. I mean, I would say that might be the first record of something in the state, and that would only be a positive. So I wouldn't really be that concerned about it. Now, if you do put it up on INAT, it will tell you if it's a sensitive species, like or near of highest concern, right? And so you could use that. And then if that were the case, you could expand um, the boundary around where the observation was made, and you can make those things change that scale for the public, and change it for us, so that again, we're just using it to extract metadata.
Yeah, next question. We had a lot of people talk about I guess like those native bee boxes that you buy, right? And how much value. I guess for this project we're focused on ground nesting bees, but I don't know, I've never had luck with those at all. Even if I buy the mason bees, for example, they just I mean they're
Yeah.
first of all they're typically not native to Texas, but
Right. It
they
does
never
it
come back.
does depend on where you are, I mean, and what bees will use. Like, for example, I know of some in Southern Utah where people have them and they don't do anything. I know of ones up here in New York and they get overused. And that can be a risk to bees too, because if they're trying to go back into something that's not been cleaned out, then they can pick up pathogens from the previous year because they're evolved to find a new stem, one that fell from last year and it just happens to be the perfect height from the ground, right? So like it's actually, in some cases, a risk to bees to use these bee hotels.
Yeah, and kind of with Paul, right? You might not be familiar with Texas, but we have a lot more private land than probably other states.
Mhm.
And if you're interested, yeah, probably get to know some of these landowners. I'm sure some of them would welcome you come on the property. Make sure you get permission first,
Yep,
and
that's
then go
true.
on the property. Right, be some. There's these giant ranches, right, that are 300,000 acres. Those are a great opportunity to do some of these surveys. So reach out to them, and if they say no, they say no. But they say yes, that's a perfect opportunity.
Yeah, and it's something you can observe while you're doing everything else, from bird watching to biking to whatever it is you're into. As long as you start to create a search image, and most importantly, know that we care and that someone's really interested in these things, like that's where we get the observations. And then it's a numbers game too. Communicate with people about, have you ever seen these? Have you ever seen a place where you've seen bees going in the ground because somebody has them? They're under someone's porch or in someone's field. I mean, sometimes it's a horse pasture. I mean, it really is just kind of seemingly random until we figure out why it's not.
Yeah, so Stephanie says, how long do ground bees live compared relatively to honeybees? I guess honeybees could live forever, right? They're perennial colonies, but a typical bee lives about 21 days.
Well, so you're talking about its adult flight activity, but they're alive for a year.
Yep.
They're alive until they drop dead trying to provide for the next generation. That's what happens. You see these old females with their wings just beat up and they're just having a hard time flying and eventually they just give out.
Yep.
But yeah, they're alive. They're just underground.
I think this is a good question, right? Sometimes they can be really fast. So it's hard to get a good picture,
Yes.
right? Especially see them flying, right? Like is there like another method bee or not beekeepers, but people can use to maybe collect some bee samples and take pictures afterwards, or like are you guys
Yeah.
recommending the exact nesting site? I guess maybe a mixture of both.
Yeah, well, yeah, it could be a mixture of both. So we want the nest site because that's the unit of replication, really, right? And then we want notes about it so we know how many bees are there. But it can be very tricky to get a good close up. I've seen amazing photos of bees. I'm like, how did you do that? Right. So you get everything from like really blurry to really crisp, and a lot of that has to do with how patient you are, whether you have a macro lens, whether you know where to be at the right spot. But there are some tricks. I mean, being close to a nest entrance and having patience will help. Sometimes we'll put a little plastic Dixie cup over the entrance, and it'll, when the bee comes back, it'll kind of try to figure out what it's doing there, like how to get back in. So there's some little tricks like that. Um, and if you have the ability, you could net a bee, slow it down, and then take a photo and release it. I mean, that's possible. There's all sorts of ways to do that, but typically we get good enough photos that are sort of live action. Now, it's really important to think about photos if you have that sort of knack, and if you can do some macro photography or so forth. The head shape is really helpful for us to identify bees. The abdomen, is really helpful, as well as, the approximate size. But some, for to get to the species level, a lot of that has to be done under a microscope. So we might go back and try to figure that out in more detail with doing some additional sampling from the site once you've established it as a good research site or a good conservation site.
Mhm.
But everything from the area they're nesting to the mounds that are made, or the lack of mounds that are made from when they're digging in the ground, to the shape of the head, to the wing venation. So head, wings, thorax, those are the best from the bee's body to give us the first glimpse into them. But some stuff has to be done under a microscope.
Perfect. Yeah. So last question from Harold. To do ground nesting bees tend to stay in the localized area? What is their forage range or even nesting range, I guess, for that fact?
Yeah, so good question. Depends on the bee, depends on the bee's body size, on whether they're crepuscular or whether they're, functioning in the daytime. But we typically try to think of them as, half a kilometer is sort of their typical foraging range. Again, they can go farther. They'll opt to not go very far if they can.
Okay, perfect. Well, so really the last thing is, I guess you kind of hear my spiel at the beginning, and I'd love to do some kind of program, right? So maybe some
Right.
way that I can go to master gardener groups, because,
Yeah.
in Texas, if you're not familiar, we have 254 counties, and a
Mhm.
majority of counties have their own master gardener groups or master naturalist group, for example. And
Oh,
there's a lot of interest in, you know, maybe using this type of program. So,
yes.
what can our program do, and what can we do to work with these other groups to kind of work with your
Yeah.
project?
Yeah, so if someone's interested in using this community science project as a project to level up and master naturalists or master gardeners, I mean, that is fantastic. We've had people do that. We've had people do very detailed studies on aggregation, and then do a little presentation about the aggregation. That's what I would recommend. That would help us tremendously. You would learn a lot in the process. And so it would be like, I think it would sort of start the conversation is there an aggregation? Is there a bee nesting site that's close enough for you to study reliably, right? Because you want to be able to go throughout the activity period, in order to get all the bits of information. So, and then if there is, reach out to us, and also Garrett, um, and use the email that we've put out there as groundnestingbees um, at gmail.com, and you can share that in the chat, or I can, while
Yep.
we're
Well,
while we're chatting. And so that's fantastic. So then, there's ways to develop it. I mentioned collecting a soil sample from that site that we'll process and add to the database. We also put out, like, if it's a good aggregation, we'll put out these emergence traps, and we'll capture bees that are coming out of the ground in order to get, when do they come out of the ground, who are they associating with. We can work on identifying the bee parasites, but also the non-bee parasites of those bees. So there's all these different steps in studying their biology. And for folks that have that other inclinations, there's ways to study the nest architecture, study the number of offspring, all cool things. How much time they spend underground, that could be done sitting in a lawn chair with just taking notes.
yep.
So there's a lot of cool opportunities to learn from these bees.
Well, perfect. Yeah. So after we end the stream, you guys will get an automatic email with the recording of this. This will also be posted on our YouTube page and our Facebook pages. I'll also send a follow-up email to everybody with any additional information we have. So one, I'll send you information on how to sign up for our listserv. So we have webinars throughout the entire year. They're not all honeybee focused. Sometimes we talk about like
Mhm.
the pollinator of the month, like mason bees, for example. So and we could potentially add another webinar to kind of walk through how to use iNaturalist if you're not familiar. So we'll have that information
Right.
about our Facebook page, and then any information that Jordan shares with me, you guys will get an email here very shortly. So
Yeah, well, fantastic. And I did just throw in the chat this little link here for these infographics, and some great infographics that help you share the project a little bit more broadly with a flyer, but also learn what to look for, and then some cool background on bees and how they form aggregations, as well as their parasites. And so take a look at that. Feel free to share those materials as broadly as you want. And also, thank you everybody for joining and being part of this conversation. This was not how this was supposed to go, but I'm very happy that we had such a productive conversation. And I feel like this was pretty apt here, this little beehaw. So
perfect.
you guys in Texas, yeah, beehaw,
You get that in
everybody.
Texas?
No, well, I don't know. Somebody gifted it to me, but it seems fitting.
Well, perfect. Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much. And we always have Jordan back again. So
Yeah,
we'll get a presentation already. So you want the more formal presentation, but I think it's good to have a kind of a back and forth with
it was
everybody.
fun.
So
Yeah, good.
all right. Well, thank you very much. And you guys will get some emails here shortly.
Appreciate you.